Hello, welcome to Varnblog. And today we're going to talk about Murray Bookchin's 1986 polemic, published in the Socialist Review, on Bernie Sanders, called The Bernie Sanders Politics When Socialism Grows Old. I reference this essay all the time, so I figured it was time for me to cover it because while I don't often agree with Bookchin's politics, it's clear to me that he was onto something on Sanders really early on. He wasn't the only critic of Sanders from the time period. Alexander Coburn and many counterpunch contributors talked about Sanders later on and his relationship to the Democratic Party, imperialism and universing, etc. But Bookchin goes deeper, and I think sees a problem that's going to emerge in this kind of social democratic baby boomerism that became popular, as an answer to a bunch of problems in the Democratic Party, but ends up ultimately revitalizing it in some key ways. And I think what Bookchin says in 1986 gave us a hint to what was going to happen after 2016. You can find this article available for free in the Anarchist Library. And in fact, I'm going to put a link for it in the show notes. And that is the version that we're going to be using tonight. All right. I'll be sharing the text since I have it on the interwebs. Murray Bookchin's The Bernie Sanders Paradox When Socialism Grows Old. Posters that appeared all over Burlington, Vermont's largest city, population 37,000, in the winter of 1980-81 were arresting and provocative. They showed an old map of the city with a label slapped across it, read, "For Sale." A bold slogan across the top, in turn, proclaimed that, quote, "Burlington is not for sale," and smiling amicably in the right-hand corner was a youngish, fairly well-known face of Bernie Sanders, sans tie, open-collared, almost endearingly shy and unpretentious. The onlooker was enjoined to rescue Burlington by voting for Bernie Sanders for mayor. Sanders, the longtime gubernatorial candidate of Vermont's Maverick Liberty Union, was now challenging Gordy Paquette, an inert Democratic fixture in City Hall who had successfully fended off equally inert Republican opponents for nearly a decade. That's interesting because people talk about how, this is Vine talking, how Sanders converted a largely Republican state to a largely Democratic state. I think this is over attributed to Sanders, considering that while New Hampshire and to some degree Maine are still fairly conservative, Vermont kind of went the same way as New England as a whole. In some ways, though, much more progressive. What's interesting there, though, is that the challenge was against a Democrat, a stodgy Democrat, and it was Sanders as an outsider candidate, kind of like a socialist version of Jesse Ventura, if you remember that from the 90s. Anyway, and interesting, unlike Jesse Ventura, who did achieve gubernatorial status, Sanders achieved mayoral status, which is interesting to think about. That Sanders won this election on March 3rd, 1981, by only 10 votes is now a Vermont legend that has percolated throughout the country over the past 5 years. What gives Sanders almost legendary qualities as a mayor and politician is that he claims himself to be a socialist. To many admiring acolytes, a Marxist, who is now in the midpoint of a third term after rolling up a huge margins in the two previous elections. From the 10-point lead to some 52% of the electorate, Sanders has ballooned out of Burlington in a fury of civic tournaments that has variously cast him as a working class hero or a demonic Bolshevik. His victories now make the New York Times, and his trips outside of Burlington take him to places as far as Mantigua, where he visited Daniel Ortega, and to the Monthly Review's fundraising backlinks, where he rubs shoulders with New York's radical elite. It's interesting how the Monthly Review used to play the word verso. The verso loss. Funny that. Or Jacobin, which in some ways has the same kind of politics as Sanders. It's funny how far we've come. Sanders has been invited to the Socialist Scholars Conference, an offer he wisely declined. Neither scholarship nor theory is Sanders' forte. If socialist he be, he is of the bread and butter kind whose preference for realism over ideals has earned him notoriety even within his closest co-workers in City Hall. The crossing lines that deface almost every serious attempt to draw an intelligible sketch of Sanders' administration and its meaning for radicals result in a deep-seated paradox in the bread and butter socialism itself. It trivializes the larger issues. To deal with Sanders merely as a personality or to evaluate his achievements in stark terms of lavish praise or damning blame. A sophomoric tribute to Sanders' doings in the Monthly Review of the year ago was a maladroit as the thundering letters of denunciation that appears in the Burlington Free Press. It's interesting thinking about what Monthly Review was praising Bernie Sanders. Sanders fits neither the heaven-sent role he is given in the radical monthlies nor the demonic one he acquires in conservative letters to moderate dailies. To dwell heavily on his well-known paranoia and suspicious reclusiveness beclouds the more important fact that he is a centralist, who is more committed to accumulating power in the mayor's office than he is to giving it to the people. To spoof him for his unadorned speech and macho manner is to ignore the fact that his notions of class analysis are narratively productivist and would embarrass a Lenin, not to mention a Marx. To mark him at his stolid behavior and unsurprising conventionality of his values is to conceal his commitment to the 30s belief that technological progress, business-like efficiency, and naive adherence to the benefit of growth. The logic of all these ideas is that the democratic practice is seen secondary to the full belly. The earthy proletariat tends to be eulogized over the effete intellectuals, and the environmental feminist and communitarian issues are regarded as petit bourgeois frivolities by comparing them with the material needs of working people. Whether the two sides of this balance sheet need to be placed at odds with each other is a problem that neither Sanders nor many radicals of his kind have fully resolved. The tragedy is that Sanders did not live out his life between 1870 and 1940, and the paradox that faces him is, why does the constellation of ideas that seemed so rebellious 50 years ago to appear so conservative today? Or radical 40 years later? That's why I'm talking. This, let me note, is not only Sanders' problem, it's one that confronts a very sizable part of the left today. One of the ironies I said that actually Occupy is actually the left, despite seeming to be more efficacious, although it didn't achieve anything it said it was going to achieve after Occupy, actually used Occupy's failure to double down on things that were not as ambitious and to not achieve them either. Oh, the irony of ironies of reformism as practicality. Sanders is by no means the sole focus of this paradox. In fact, the Sanders' problems, personal as they may seem, reflect a problem that exists in the Burlington itself. Contrary to the notion that Vermont is what America used to be, the state, and particularly Burlington, is more like what America is becoming than what America was. Major corporations in the city and its environments are IBM and GE. And the GE plant in Burlington makes the only Gatling gun in the United States, a horrendous fact that should by all rights trouble any socialist mayor. The Old North End, Sanders' sans-culottes wards, numbers 2 and 3, consist in large part of homebred Vermonters who work in service, repair, and maintenance jobs when they have jobs at all. The remaining 4 wards are filled with newcomers into the city and with elderly people who have the luck to own their homes. Basically, middle class and working values to form the peppermill of own Vermonters and new professionals, a term that embraces anyone from insurance brokers, real estate operators, realtors to doctors, lawyers to professors. An asterisk. This is the irony of Bernie Sanders as an answer to the PMC problem, then people feeling betrayed by that later on. Is that it's PMCers themselves that are promoting this in PMC areas. Now, I don't think the PMC is a coherent class, but I'm holding people to their own value statements. Funny how when you talk about the working class, it mysteriously looks like you, but then so does the enemy. What an irony that is. Let us continue. Hippies are still mingle freely with yuppies. Indeed, in egalitarian Vermont, there's a reasonable degree of intercourse between the wealthy, the well-to-do, and the poor. That's not true anymore anywhere. That's foreign talking. What is the most important Burlington is a town in a frenzied transition, a sleepy little place some 50 years ago with bacon and eggs diners, hardware stores, clothing emporiums, and even a gun shop in the center of town is becoming a beehive of activity. Electronics in all forms move into Vermont, together with boutiques, inns, hotels, office buildings, educational institutions, and in Burlington, particularly, a thriving academic establishment that draws thousands of students and their parents into the commercial fold. I just want to point out the idea that Sanders is basically a working class rebellion in Vermont doesn't fit the reality of his electoral base. Doesn't. It just doesn't. It may have fit the reality of his electoral base in the 2016 Democratic primaries, but even then, that's questionable. The problems of modernization confront the town produce very mixed reactions, and not only in its inhabitants, but in Sanders. A large number of people feel plundered, including some of the plunderers. And if you are to believe them, Burlington is living evidence that myth can be real, even more real than reality itself. Accordingly, myth holds up Burlington as a small, homing, caring, crime-free, independent, mutualistic, liberal, and innocently American in its beliefs, and that everything good that can happen, if one wills it to be. The glowing American optimism, in my view, one of our national assets. That's not one of my views, and we no longer have it, but I always thought it was blinding. That's what I'm talking. Often lives in a doleful contradiction with the fact that everything good can happen and everything bad does happen, including union busting, growing contrast between the rich and the poor, housing shortages, rising rents, gentrification, pollution, parking problems, traffic congestion, increasing crime, enemy, and growth. More growth and still more growth, upwards, inwards, and outwards. The tension between myth and reality is as strong as between one set of realities and another. Burlingtonians generally do not like what is happening, although there is far too many of them who are making the most of it. Even the alleged benefits of growth and modernization are riddled by their own internal contradictions. If there are more jobs and a little unemployment, then there is lower pay and rising living cost. If there are more tourists and very little amiable citizenry to receive them, there is less spread of income across social lines and more robberies. If there is more construction and less labor shortages, there are fewer homes and more newcomers. By the way, these are all true and all contradictions just ignored in progressive and liberal and democratic socialist discourse. Office buildings and gentrification go hand in hand with fewer small businesses and far too many people who need inexpensive shelter. Very crucial to all this is the conflict of values and cultures that modernization produces. Basically, Burlingtonians want to keep their city intimate, caring, and liberal. They like to believe that they are living an older way of life with modern conveniences and in accordance with fiscally independent values that are rooted in a colorful past. It is this underlying independence of Vermonters generally, including newcomers who absorbed into Burlington, that makes the clash between a lingering libertarian Yankee tradition and a corrosive authoritarian corporate reality so inherently explosive. Ironically, Bernie Sanders owns his political career to the irascible public behavior that this libertarian tradition produces, and yet he understands this behavior very little. To Sanders, Burlington is basically Detroit, as it was 2 generations ago, and the fact that the town was not for sale in 1981 carried mixed messages to him and through the electorate. To the electorate, the slogan meant that the city and its values were priceless, and its were to be guarded and preserved as much as possible. To Sanders, all rhetoric aside, it meant that the city, although not on the auction block, was generally a high price tag. Whether the electorate who voted for him was less realistic than Sanders is not relevant. The fact is that both saw sale of a city from a different, if not radically opposing, perspectives. Both, in fact, were guided by varying degrees of reality principles. The electorate wanted a greater say in the city's future. Sanders wanted to bring more efficiency to this disposition. The electorate wanted to preserve the city's human scale and quality of life. Sanders wanted it to grow accordingly to a well-designed plan and with due regard for cost effectiveness. The electorate, in effect, saw Burlington as a home and wanted to keep the emphasis on old style values alive. Sanders, together with many of his opponents, saw it as a business and wanted its growth to be beneficial, presumably to working people. This is not to deny that Burlington was a fair share of economic predators and political operators, or that property taxes are very important and material problems ranging from shelter to the cost of food are very real. But this town has also a deep sense of municipal pride and is highly independent, even idiosyncratic. Populations exclude a form of local patriotism that fades as one approaches larger, less historically conscious, and less environmentally oriented communities. Sanders would never admit that for Burlingtonians, the electorate independence has begun to clash with his fading regard for democratic practice. That technological progress and structural growth can arouse more suspicion than enthusiasm. That the quality of life runs neck and neck as an issue with material benefits. And indeed, for Sanders and his administration, the two are not necessarily identical. 30s socialism is notable for the fact that it rescues a marketplace from anarchy, not that it necessarily changes the market system as such and its impact on the city. In Sanders' vision of socialism, there is a sharp business orientation towards Burlington as a well-managed corporate enterprise. Herein lies the greatest irony of all. And basically, this is I agree with Chris Catrone and with Murray Bookchin that Sanders thus represents the revenge of Fordism being adopted by the opponents of Fordism in the New Left. Like, this was never really a socialist project. The socialism here was a Fordist socialism. It was about integration of the working class into a corporate entity, not about class independence as such. And it shows up in the confusion of Sanders' rhetoric and policy. Herein lies the greatest irony of all. All rhetoric aside, Bernie Sanders' version of socialism is proving to be a subtle instrument for rationalizing the marketplace, not for controlling it, much less threatening it. Bing, bing, bing. His 30s type radicalism, like Frankenstein's monster, is rising up to challenge its own creator. In this respect, Sanders does not make history. More often than not, he is one of his victims. Hence, to understand the direction he is following and the problems it raises for radicals generally, it's important not to focus on not only on his rhetoric, which makes his administration so alluring to socialists inside and outside of Vermont, but to take a hard look at the realities of its practice. Sanders' record. Sanders has claimed that he has created an open government in Burlington is premised on the very elastic assumption that one means by the word open. The Sanders prides himself on being responsive to underprivileged people in Burlington who are faced with evictions, lack of heat, wretched housing conditions, and the ills of poverty is not evidence of openness. That is, if we assume that the term means greater municipal democracy and public participation. What often passes for open government in the Sanders cosmos is that the mayor's willingness to hear the complaints and distress signals of his clients and courtiers, not in responsibility to give them any appreciable share in the city's government. What Sanders dispenses under the name of open government is personal paternalism rather than democracy. By the way, this is why I accused most of the Sanders supporters of being soft left Bonapartist. And in that way, as Bonapartist populists, not that different from Trump. And I know that was a relatively, and still is a relatively unpopular position to take. There is nothing that resembles Berkeley's elaborate network of grassroots organizations and councils that feed into City Hall. When it comes to municipal democracy, Sanders is surprisingly tight-fisted and plays his cards very close to his chest. Queried shortly after his 1981 election on a local talk show, Can You Quote Me?, Sanders was pointedly asked if he favored town meeting government, a very traditional form of citizen assemblies that has deep-seated roots in Vermont townships. Sanders' response was pointed as a question. It was an emphatic no. After expressing his proclivity for the present aldermanic system, the mayor was to enter into a chronic battle with the Republican Board of Aldermen over the appointments and requests that were to be stubbornly rejected by the very system of government that had his early sanction. Sanders' quarrels with the Board of Aldermen did not significantly alter his identification of open government with personal paternalism. As an accepted fixture in the Burlington civic politics, he now runs the city with cool self-assurance, surrounded by a small group of half a dozen or so aides who formulate his best ideas and who occasionally receive his most strident verbal abuse. The Mayor's Council on the Arts is hand-picked affair, whether by the mayor directly or by a completely dedicated devotee. Similarly, the mayor's youth office, it is difficult to tell when Sanders will create another council, or more appropriately, an office, except to note that there is a peace, environmental, and gay communities, not to speak of the unemployed, elderly, welfare, and many other constituents which have no mayor's council in City Hall. Nor is it clear to what extent that any of the existing councilors authentically represent local organizations and or tendencies that exist in the subcultures and deprived communities in Burlington. Sanders is a centralist, and his administration, despite its democratic proclivities, tends to look more like a civic oligarchy than a municipal democracy. The neighborhood planning assemblies, MPAs, were introduced in Burlington's 6 wards in the autumn of 1982 and have been widely touted as evidence of grassroots democracy, where no institutions that originated in were not institutions that originated in Sanders' heads. Their origin is fairly complex and stems from a welter of notions that were floating around Burlington and neighborhood organizations was gathered shortly after Sanders' 1981 election to develop ideas for wider citizen participation in the city and its affairs. The people in the administration played a role in forming assemblies that were indisputably true, but so too did others who have since come to oppose Sanders for positions he has compromised his pledges to the electorate. Bernard Sanders' view of government appears in most sharply etched form in an interview the mayor gave to a fairly sympathetic reporter on the Burlington Free Press in June 1984, headlined "Sanders' Work Expands the Mayor's Role." The story carried out a portrait of a mayor in one or more pensive moods with the quote, "We are absolutely rewriting the role of what city government is supposed to be doing in the state of Vermont." The article leaped immediately into the whole thrust of Sanders' vision of government, to expand and strengthen the role of the mayor's office in the city government. This process has been marked by expanding the City Hall staff and an increased role in the selection of a new fire chief, a similar in the police department, and in developing such issues such as the downtown hotel. In response to criticism that Sanders has been centralizing in power and reducing the checks and balances in city government, his supporters stressed that citizen input through both the neighborhood planning assemblies and expanded voter output had generally increased, that the neighborhood planning assemblies have essentially been permitted to languish in an atmosphere of benign neglect, and that the voter participation in elections hardly equitable to the participation by the citizenry has left the mayor thoroughly unruffled. A fair consideration of the results produced by Sanders' increased role in city affairs produces a good test of political strategy that threatens to create institutional forms for a Burlington version of the New York mayor's cottage. The best case scenario The best case for the mayors appears to be in the monthly review of May 1984, where a Pollyanna article written by Beth Bates, writer and farmer, celebrates the virtues of Sanders' effort as socialism on the local level, followed, I might add, by a prudent question mark. Like Sanders' own claims, the main thrust of the article is that the socialist administration is efficient. Sanders has shown that radicals, too, can be fiscal conservatives, even when they are concerned that the government does little things that make life a little bit more comfortable, like street repair, volunteer aid to dig paths for the elderly after snowstorms, and save money. The administration brings greater revenues into the city's coffers by modernizing the budgetary process, principally by investing its money in high-return institutions, opening city contracts to competitive bidding, centralizing purchasing, and slapping fees on a whole range of items like building permits, utility excavations, private fire and police alarms, and the like. That Sanders out-Republican the Republicans should not be taken lightly. Viewed in terms of the overall economic policies, the Sanders administration bears certain fascinating similarities to the Reagan administration. What Sanders has adopted with the visits is trickle-down economics, philosophy that growth for profit has a spillover effect in creating jobs and improving public welfare. Not surprisingly, the city's 1984 annual report of the Community and Economic Development Office, a Sanders creation, really begins with a clunky section on the UDAG spur development. UDAG are Urban Develop Action Grants, which are meant to leverage commitments to growth by the private sector, aka Bernie Sanders was still a neoliberalizer. The office celebrates the fact that these grants requests to Washington will yield $20 million from the private sector and create an estimated 556 new full-time permanent jobs and generate an additional 332,638 per year in property taxes. Among the major achievements, this grant will help the owners of the Radisson Hotel in Burlington, an eyesore that is blocking out part of the Burlington's magnificent Lakeview and corporate playground, if there ever was one, expand their property by, quote, 57 guest rooms and an additional 10,000 square feet of meeting and banquet space. A new 505 space parking garage with covered access to the hotel will be constructed. The Radisson Hotel will now be able to accommodate regional and association conventions. The project also includes an expansion of retail space, 3,500 square feet within Burlington Square Mall. Construction has begun, and the project is scheduled in completion in late 1985. Other grants are less lascivious, but they invariably deal with projects to either construction or to rehabilitate office, commercial, industrial, and department store construction, aside from the noxious Sanders Waterfront scheme, of which more shortly. One seriously wonders what kind of descriptive material it is meant to satisfy potential employees who commonly sell their labor power for the minimum wage rates in the city that notoriously is close to unionization. The Old North Enders, who are the recipients of scanty rehabilitation funds and a land trust program for the purchase of houses, an innovative idea that is still to fully prove itself out. A small businessman who has received loans to develop their enterprises, or other who have their facades improved, and what Sanders celebrates is an attempt to revitalize the Old North End, an area that is still one of the most depressed in Vermont. The ill-housed and elderly, for whom the office building spree makes a limited amount of low-income housing construction seem like a mockery of their needs. Apart from the condos and so-called moderate-income housing that have surfaced in the part of the city, housing for the underprivileged is not a recurring theme in Sanders' speeches, except when the mayor is on the electoral warpath after a tentative stab at some kind of rent control was defeated at the polls on the heels of a huge propaganda blitz by the well-to-do property owners. The administration has been reticent about raising rent controls generally, let alone making a concerted effort at educating the public about them. Burlington, in effect, is witnessing one of the journalistic wags has appropriately called the gentrification with the human face. Indeed, such crucial issues as housing for the poor and elderly, unionization of the grossly underpaid, environmental deterioration, and rapid attrition of old, socially useful small concerns that can no longer afford the soaring downtown rentals have been taking second place during the past year to big structural schemes like the Waterfront plan. More so than other Sanders proposals, this plan has opened a long overdue schism between the mayor and his popular supporters in the Old North End, the most radical constituency in Burlington. Sanders' Waterfront plan is burdened by a highly convoluted history that would take an article itself to unravel. The 24.5 acre property, owned partly by the Vermont Central Railroad, the Aldine Corporation, a consortium of rough locals, and the city itself, faces one of the most scenic latent mountain areas in the Northeast. Paquette, Sanders' predecessor, planned to develop this spectacular site with high-rise condos. Sanders has made the demand for a waterfront for the people a cardinal issue in all his campaigns. Civic democracy was ostensibly served when an open meeting was organized by the administration in February 1983 to formulate priorities about which the public felt should be reflected in any design. Broken down by wards in the MPA fashion, the meeting's priorities were centered around walkways, open spaces, public access, restaurants, shops, even a museum and a wildlife sanctuary, in addition to smaller public amenities, mixed housing. Where these priorities could have been met without a UDAG is highly problematical. What is fascinating about Sanders' response, even before the UDAG was refused, was the clutter of the structures that grossly compromised the whole thrust of the public's priorities. A second version of the Radisson-type hotel, a retail pavilion that spanned half of the length of the city's pedestrian mall, a 1,200 car parking garage, an office building, a narrow public walkway around the lakeside, an ambitious promise to provide 300 mixed housing units, presumably, quote, available for low and moderate income and or handicapped people. Even so, the housing proposal was hedged by such caveats as, to the extent feasible, and the need to acquire below market financing and rent level subsidies. Following the refusal of the UDAG, the plan resurfaced again from the City Hall and two notable alterations. Mixed housing disappeared completely as even a promise, replaced by 150 to 300 condos priced at $107,000 to $300,000 each. This is a 1986 money, guide. That's actually probably would be almost triple that now. Typical Burlington houses sell for 70 to 80,000, and a public space meager to begin with was attenuated. From the residential standpoint, the waterfront for the people had become precisely an enclave for the rich, one of the verbal thunderbolts Sanders had directed at the Paquette proposal. The privileges accorded to the waterfront plan to the money people are a reminder that only token and has been provided to the poor. Only token aid has been provided to the poor. The methods employed by Sanders engineering public consent for the plan has been especially offensive. The blitz of ads favoring the mayor and the Aldine Corporation's version of the scheme, in which Sandinistas found their name listed with those of the most notorious union busters in the state, stands in sharp contrast with a relatively weak campaign funded by City Hall on behalf of rent control and improved housing. The public reaction came to head when the electorate, summoned by a vote on a bond issue to cover the city's contributions to the plan, produced a startling result. Despite the sheer frenzy marked by the mayor's campaign for a yes vote, the word-by-word returns revealed a remarkable shift in the social attitudes towards Sanders. Although a two-thirds majority is needed to carry a bond issue in Burlington, Ward 2 and 3 of the Old North End voted down the bond issue flatly. So much so that the reaction of the Sanders working class base had given the mayors his largest polarities in the past. Ward 4, a conventional middle class district, regaled the mayor with barely a simple majority of 5 votes, and Ward 5, the most sympathetic of the middle class constituency, was a flat 15-vote rejection. Sanders' highest returns came from Ward 6, the Hill as it is so called, which contains the highest concentration of wealth in the city and its most spacious and expansive mansions. For the first time, a Sanders proposal had patently placed the mayor's public credibility on the line that had been soundly trounced, not by the wealthiest ward in Burlington, which alone supported the bond issue by a two-thirds vote, but by the Old North End, which flatly rejected his proposal. A class issue had emerged, which now seemed to have reflected a disgust with the rhetoric that yields little visible results. The ultimate effect of Sanders' aging form of socialism is to facilitate ease with business interests can profit from the city. I want to add in that this is what guest the show me Ball was talking about a year ago, and we talked about how neoliberalization was actually easier under Keynesian and or social democratic apparatuses in Sweden or Latin America than it was often on conservative ones, where certain things like pensions were not seen as under state control in the same way or would have negative effects if done by the right. In many ways, Sanders, while not as rampant of a neoliberalizer, still participated in his actual running of the executive, something that his running as a senator or in legislative capacities can be hidden. But we know what he would have done in the executive because we have his record as a mayor, even though it is a good almost 40 years for his running at the national level. In many ways, Sanders' view reflected an even more delusional form of Corbynism, and I have my critiques of Corbynism that were always unpopular too, that they posited a return to a productive base that was based on the empire at a time when the empire of Britain was no longer viable, that they promised something to a younger, urban, largely poor, quasi-working class base without being able to build it out wide into the countryside, into the more impoverished areas, and had a totally incoherent stance on Brexit because Corbyn couldn't reconcile his constituencies. But at least he was actually in charge of his party, which is something we could never say about Sanders. Now, the thinness of Corbyn's control over labor was made very clear how quick it was able to get rid of him for whatever reason. But with Sanders, you have the fact that at most you had, 8 or 9 Congress people, no senatorial base, and a few mayors, but no gubernatorial bases. for building a coalition in the Democratic Party, let's be frank, that would be dead on arrival to actually achieve anything that would not be in the interest of the same kind of people that fund the Biden and Clinton campaigns. And if you don't see that, you don't understand how politics works. And no matter how much hope and change you could have given yourself, you wouldn't have been able to change that. Luckily, maybe in some ways, you didn't have to. But to say that Bernie Sanders betrayed the people was to miss that this had happened before, and maybe it's your responsibility to know it. Anyway, back to the text. Beyond the dangers of increasingly centralized civic machinery, one must eventually be inherited by a Republican administration, are an extraordinary privileges Sanders has provided to the most predatory enterprises in Burlington. Privileges that have been justified by socialism that is committed to growth, planning, and order, and a blue-collar radicalism that yields low-paying jobs in non-union establishments without any regard to the quality of life and the environmental well-being of the community at large. Bernie Sanders could have established an example of radical municipalism, one rooted in Vermont's localist tradition of direct democracy that might have served as a living educational arena for developing an active citizenry and a popular political culture. Whether it was because of a shallow productivist notion of socialism oriented around growth and efficiency, or simply personal careerism, the Burlington mayor has been guided by a strategy that sacrifices education to the mobilization and democratic principles to pragmatic results. The managerial radicalism with its technocrat bias and its corporate concern for expansive is bourgeois to the core, and it even brings the authenticity of traditional socialist canons into grave question. A recent Burlington Free Press headline declared, "Bernie Sanders unites with businesses on the waterfront," which could be taken as a verdict by local business establishment as a whole that it is not they who have been joining Sanders, but Sanders who has been joining them. The productivist forms of socialism began to resemble corporate forms of capitalism, aka social democracy and Fordism look the same. And from the standpoint of their nostalgia for them, ended up being the same. But one is corporatist, the other is theoretically not corporatist. It may be well to ask how these inversions occur and whether or not they are accidental at all. The question is not only one that should concern Sanders and his supporters, it is a matter of grim concern for the American radical community as a whole. One that, dare I say, that community ignored and then lost on massively without building the institutions. Now, I don't share Bookchin's municipalist concerns, but I actually think he's right about the limitations of what Sanders ended up doing and what Sanders would have done at the national level, particularly without building a counter apparatus to the Democratic Party, which no one really attempted to do. And in many ways, the Sanders movement was responsible for revitalizing the Democratic Party and tying people more firmly to it than even in the 90s and aughts, where the left felt like it should venture out on its own, even if it meant constant losing. And here we are today, where we look to be heading back to the same stances of the late 70s and 1980s that led us to Murray Bookchin's polemic against Bernie Sanders, all those nearly 50 years ago. It would take millennials to try to vindicate the baby boomers' views of socialism as read through nostalgia for Fordism and failed social democracy. Nonetheless, here we are. Like and subscribe.